She was rejected for being too fat, laughed at, left standing in the mud while the town jeered. But before the echoes of their cruelty faded, a shadow stepped from the edge of the street, a mountain man with a scarred face and eyes like winter. He didn't mock her. He lifted her trunk from the dirt and said, "If he don't want her, I will." From that moment, her life took a turn no one in Silver Bend would ever forget. Up in the high mountains, where snow buries the trails and secrets never stay buried, their fragile peace hides something dark, a letter sealed with the Army's mark, and a past soaked in guilt. When a dying Apache child appears at their door, mercy will cost more than either can imagine. Now, love and faith are tested against shame, law, and the ghosts of war. Will a woman once cast aside be the one to save the man who saw her worth, or lose him to the sins he can't forgive himself for? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bend's dusty main street as the stagecoach rattled to a stop. Layla Hargrove's hands trembled as she gripped the letter that had brought her here. 2 pages of promise and hope from Ralph McConnell, who'd written of needing a wife to help run his ranch and raise his children. The paper was worn soft at the creases from her reading it over and over during the 2-week journey from Missouri. The driver called out, "Silver Bend, Colorado." His voice carried on the sharp October wind that whipped at Layla's skirts and sent scattered leaves dancing across the packed dirt street. Layla smoothed her travel-wrinkled dress and touched her hair, trying to tame the wisps that had escaped during the bumpy ride. Her heart fluttered with equal parts excitement and nervousness as she peered through the coach window at the cluster of people gathered outside the telegraph office. "Let me help you down, ma'am," the driver said, offering his hand. She accepted his assistance, stepping carefully onto the wooden sidewalk. Her legs felt unsteady after so many hours of travel, but she held her head high. This was to be her fresh start, her chance at happiness. A man stepped forward from the crowd, tall and lean, with graying temples and a pressed suit that marked him as someone of means. Ralph McConnell. He looked just as he'd described himself in his letters, and Layla's heart lifted. But as their eyes met, she watched his welcoming smile fade into something else entirely. "Miss Hargrove," he said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Yes, Mr. McConnell." Layla tried to keep her voice steady. "I'm so pleased to finally meet you." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for ages. Ralph's gaze traveled from her face down to her sturdy frame, taking in every inch of her plain appearance and full figure. When he spoke again, his words cut like ice. "This won't do at all," he declared loudly. "Why, you're far too heavy to keep up with ranch work. The letter said you were suited for hard labor, but I can't imagine you lasting half a day." Snickers rippled through the gathered crowd. Someone whispered, "Poor Ralph, he sure got took." Another voice added, "Guess the photograph she sent was from her younger days." Layla's cheeks burned. She hadn't sent a photograph. Ralph had never asked for one. "Sir, I assure you I'm strong and capable." No, Ralph interrupted, backing away as if her very presence offended him. "This was clearly a mistake. I won't be saddled with a woman who'll eat more than she's worth." More laughter erupted from the onlookers. The stagecoach driver had already begun unloading her trunk, and with a careless shove, it toppled off the edge of the sidewalk into a muddy puddle left by yesterday's rain. Layla blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. But her mind raced. She had spent nearly every penny she had on the stagecoach ticket. The nearest big town was 40 miles away. Night was coming, and she had nowhere to go. "Mr. McConnell, please," she said softly. Your letters spoke of kindness and Christian charity. And yours spoke of a capable woman fit for ranch work, he sneered. I've been deceived, and I won't honor any promise made under false pretenses. The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the spectacle. Layla could feel their stares, hear their whispered judgments. Her throat felt tight, but she forced herself to stand straight, even as her eyes stung with unshed tears. Then movement at the edge of the crowd caught her attention. A man stepped forward, his presence parting the onlookers like Moses at the Red Sea. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing worn buckskins and a weather-beaten hat. A massive gray wolfhound padded silently at his heels. The man's face was partially hidden by a thick beard, but his eyes were clear and steady as they met Ralph's. Without a word, he strode to where Layla's trunk lay in the mud. In one fluid motion, he lifted it as if it weighed nothing, settling it carefully back onto the wooden sidewalk. If you don't want her, the stranger said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. I will. The laughter died instantly. Ralph's face reddened. Now see here, Jackson Grant. The lady came here in good faith, Jackson continued, as if Ralph hadn't spoken. And you're showing mighty poor manners, McConnell. Layla stared at this unexpected defender, her heart pounding. Jackson Grant's clothes might be rough, but there was nothing crude about his bearing or the quiet authority in his voice. This ain't your business, Grant, Ralph blustered, but his voice had lost its mocking edge. Making it my business. Jackson turned to Layla, his expression softening slightly. Ma'am, if you're willing, I've got a cabin up near Timber Creek. It ain't fancy, but it's warm and dry. Could use help with some mending and cooking, if you've a mind for it. Layla looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of mockery or cruel intentions. She found none, only straightforward honesty, and something that might have been kindness. I don't know you, sir, she managed to say. No, ma'am, you don't, he agreed. But you know what kind of man he is now. He nodded toward Ralph, who was backing away, his moment of cruel triumph thoroughly spoiled. And I give you my word, you'll be treated with respect under my roof. The wolfhound moved closer, pressing against Layla's skirts as if offering its own reassurance. She reached down automatically to touch its massive head, and the animal leaned into her hand. Seems Thor's already made up his mind about you, Jackson said, the barest hint of a smile touching his eyes. He's a fair judge of character. Layla looked around at the dispersing crowd, at Ralph McConnell's retreating back, at her mud-splattered trunk. Then she looked back at Jackson Grant, who waited patiently for her answer. Yes, she said finally, her voice growing stronger. Yes, Mr. Grant, I would be grateful for your offer. Jackson nodded once, then bent to lift her trunk again. Thor, mind the lady, he said to the wolfhound, who immediately took up position at Layla's side. My wagon's just down the street. As they walked away from the telegraph office, Layla heard the whispers start up again behind them. But they seemed distant now, unimportant. The wind that had felt so cold before now carried the scent of pine trees and approaching winter, and somehow it didn't seem quite so bitter anymore. She watched Jackson's straight back as he carried her trunk, noticed how the townspeople stepped aside respectfully as he passed. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing with certainty. This quiet mountain man had just shown more Christian charity than all of Ralph McConnell's flowery letters combined. The wolfhound's warm bulk pressed against her skirts, steady and reassuring as they made their way down Silver Bend's main street toward whatever future awaited. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered street as Jackson Grant secured Layla's trunk to his mule-drawn sled. The wooden runners were reinforced with metal strips, built to handle the rough mountain terrain, and heavy loads of furs he typically transported. Today, they would carry precious human cargo. "Ma'am," Jackson said, extending his calloused hand to help her up. "Mind your step. The boards can be slick." Layla gathered her skirts and accepted his assistance, carefully climbing onto the sled's wooden seat. The rough blanket he'd spread across it scratched against her wool dress, but she welcomed its warmth as the temperature continued to drop. Thor, who she now learned was actually named Boone, leaped up and settled at her feet, his thick fur providing an additional barrier against the cold. Jackson took his place beside her, gathering the reins. The two mules, solid, sturdy creatures with frost-tipped ears, responded to his quiet click, and they began their slow journey away from Silver Bend. The runners creaked against the packed snow, a steady rhythm that matched the mules' plodding pace. Layla watched the town grow smaller behind them, its buildings becoming toy-sized in the distance. The humiliation she'd endured at the telegraph office still stung, but each step the mules took carried her further from that painful moment. She glanced at her silent companion, studying his profile in the fading light. "Mr. Grant," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to thank you for what you did back there. Your kindness—" She trailed off, unsure how to express the depth of her gratitude. Jackson kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but nodded once in acknowledgement. "No need for thanks, ma'am. Man ought to behave better than that." After a moment, he added, "I live up in God's quiet, as my pa used to say. Ain't much for company most times, but you're welcome to stay until you sort things out." They passed frozen creeks, where ice had formed fantastic shapes, like crystal sculptures in the waning light. The path wound through stands of burned pine trees, their blackened trunks stark against the snow, remnants of some past fire that had scarred the landscape. Yet even here, Layla noticed small signs of life. Tiny evergreen seedlings pushing through the snow, a mountain jay flitting between branches. The sun dipped behind the snow-covered ridges, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Layla pulled her shawl tighter, watching her breath form little clouds in the cooling air. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. Rather, it felt like a natural state, as if words would somehow intrude upon the mountain's peaceful solitude. Boone shifted at her feet, pressing his warm bulk more firmly against her boots. The wolfhound's presence was reassuring, a gentle guardian in this strange new world she found herself in. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, and his tail thumped softly against the sled's wooden floor. As dusk settled over the mountain, Jackson's cabin came into view. It was larger than Layla had expected, a sturdy structure built of thick logs, its roof heavy with snow. The building was set partially into the slope, using the natural contour of the land for protection against the harsh mountain weather. A thin trail of smoke rose from the stone chimney, evidence that the morning's fire still smoldered within. Jackson brought the mules to a halt near the cabin's door. "Need to tend to the animals first," he said, jumping down from the sled. "You go on inside and warm yourself. Door's not locked." Layla made her way carefully to the cabin's entrance, Boone close at her heels. The door opened with a creak, revealing a simple but well-maintained interior. A large, stone hearth dominated one wall, its ashes still warm. Rough-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and a few storage chests filled the main room. A cot was positioned against the far wall, and she could see another small room through a doorway, presumably Jackson's sleeping quarters. Moving to the woodpile stacked neatly beside the hearth, Layla selected several logs, just as she'd done countless times in her own home in Missouri. By the time Jackson entered, stamping snow from his boots, she had a fire crackling cheerfully in the fireplace. He paused in the doorway, something flickering across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. Without comment, he moved to the fire and added more wood, adjusting the logs with practiced ease to ensure they burned evenly. "Ain't much," he said, straightening up, "but it's warm and dry." He crossed to a large chest and pulled out a beautifully crafted quilt, its pattern still vibrant despite obvious age. "This was my Sarah's," he said quietly, holding it out to her. "Reckon you can use it tonight." Layla accepted the quilt with trembling hands, understanding the weight of trust being placed in her. "Thank you," she whispered, running her fingers over the careful stitching. "It's lovely." Jackson busied himself at the hearth, hanging a pot over the fire and adding ingredients for a simple stew. The familiar domestic sounds, the clank of the pot, the rustle of dried herbs, the pop and crackle of the fire, helped ease some of Layla's awkwardness. This might not be the home she'd imagined finding in Colorado, but it was shelter, and her host, though quiet, had shown nothing but kindness. When the stew was ready, Jackson filled 2 tin bowls and handed one to her, along with a spoon. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds being the fire's gentle crackle and Boone's contented sighs as he dozed near the hearth. Before taking her first bite, Layla bowed her head and folded her hands in her lap. "Dear Lord," she prayed softly, "thank you for this food, for this shelter, and for the kindness of strangers. Amen." When she looked up, she caught Jackson watching her, an unreadable expression in his eyes. He quickly returned his attention to his bowl, but not before Layla noticed something in his face. A softening, perhaps, or a distant memory stirring. After the meal, Jackson showed her where to find extra blankets and assured her the cot was comfortable enough. He disappeared into his room, leaving her to settle in for the night. Layla arranged Sarah's quilt on the cot, smoothing its worn surface with gentle hands. The fabric held stories she might never know, but she silently promised to treat it with the respect it deserved. As she lay down, Boone padded over and settled himself beside the cot, his massive head resting on his paws. The fire's dying light cast dancing shadows on the cabin's walls, and through the small window she could see stars beginning to emerge in the clear, mountain sky. Jackson sat in his room, listening to the soft sounds of Layla preparing for sleep. It had been years since anyone had said grace in his cabin, years since anyone but him had tended his fire or used Sarah's quilt. He hadn't expected how those simple acts would affect him, how they would remind him of evenings long past, when prayer and companionship had been part of his daily life. The quiet of the mountain night settled over the cabin, broken only by the occasional pop from the fireplace, and Boone's gentle snoring. In the main room, Layla drifted off to sleep beneath Sarah's quilt, while Jackson sat in his darkened room, remembering what it felt like to have prayer in the house again. Morning light spilled through the cabin's frosted windows, casting diamond patterns across the wooden floor. Layla stirred on her cot, watching dust motes dance in the pale beams. The fire had burned low overnight, and her breath made little clouds in the cool air. Beside her, Boone's tail thumped against the floor in greeting. Outside, she could hear the steady thunk of Jackson's axe splitting wood. The familiar sound had become part of her morning routine over the past few days, as regular as sunrise. She rose quietly, folding Sarah's quilt with careful hands before reaching for her shawl. The cabin's main room, though simple, had already begun to feel familiar. Layla moved to the hearth, adding kindling and small logs to rebuild the fire. Her hands knew this work well. She'd done it countless times before in her little Missouri home. As warmth began to spread through the room, she took stock of her surroundings with a housekeeper's eye. The cabin was tidy enough, but she could see places where a woman's touch was long absent. Dust had settled in corners, spider webs draped the window frames, and the tin dishes were dull with age. The sight stirred something in her heart, not pity, but purpose. When Jackson came in with an armload of split wood, she was already sweeping. He paused in the doorway, snow melting from his boots. "Mr. Grant," she said, setting the broom aside, "I'd like to earn my keep here. I can clean, mend clothes, cook proper meals." "Didn't bring you up here to work?" he interrupted, his voice gruff but not unkind. He stacked the wood neatly by the hearth. "You ain't a servant," Layla lifted her chin. "No, sir, I'm not. But I am a Christian woman who pays her debts, and I've got 2 good hands that know how to work." She gestured to the cabin around them. "Please, let me do what I can." Jackson studied her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod. "Do as you please," he said finally, then added, "Just Jackson is fine. No need for Mr. up here." That morning set the pattern for the days that followed. While Jackson worked outside, chopping wood, checking his trap lines, tending to the mules, Layla brought new life to the cabin's interior. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, and beat dust from blankets in the crisp mountain air. As she worked, she would often hum softly, old hymns her mother had taught her, their familiar melodies filling the quiet spaces. Amazing grace, what a friend we have in Jesus. Sweet hour of prayer. The songs came as naturally as breathing, keeping time with her hands as she kneaded bread dough or mended torn shirts she'd found in Jackson's chest. One afternoon, while hanging fresh-washed linens to dry by the fire, she discovered an old Bible tucked away on a high shelf. Its leather cover was worn smooth with age, its pages soft at the corners from years of turning. That evening, she cleaned it carefully and set it in the center of the table, where its presence seemed to add something vital to the room. At her small writing desk near the window, Layla penned a letter to her sister. "Dearest Mary, I know you must be worried sick about me after what happened in Silver Bend, but God works in mysterious ways, as Mama always said. I found shelter with a man named Jackson Grant, more bear than human, truth be told, with his great beard and silent ways. Yet there's kindness in him, Mary. He's given me his late wife's quilt, and never makes me feel unwelcome. His wolfhound, Boone, follows me everywhere like a faithful shadow." Outside, Jackson paused in his work, the axe half raised. Through the cabin window came the sound of Layla's voice, soft and sweet, singing a hymn he hadn't heard in years. Sarah used to hum it while she worked, that same gentle melody. The memory hit him like a physical thing, making his hands tremble on the axe handle. He found himself listening more and more as the days passed, though he tried not to show it. There was something about Layla's presence that seemed to fill empty corners he hadn't even known were there. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow, and not just from the fires she kept burning bright. The evening meals changed, too. Where once he'd eaten quickly and alone, now they sat together at the cleaned table, the old Bible between them like a silent companion. Layla would bow her head in prayer before each meal, and though Jackson didn't join in, he found himself waiting for her quiet "Amen" before beginning to eat. Words were still few between them, but the silence had changed its character. It was no longer the hollow quiet of solitude, but something softer, more companionable. Sometimes he would catch her watching him with gentle eyes, and something in his chest would tighten in a way that was both familiar and frightening. That night, as Jackson lay in his bed, sleep proved elusive. When it finally came, his dreams were filled with forgotten sounds, Sarah's laughter, the creak of her rocking chair, hymns sung in a voice he thought he'd buried with her. He woke before dawn, his pillow damp with tears he didn't remember shedding. In the main room, he found Layla already up, kneading dough by lamplight. The cabin smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and something else. The indefinable scent of home that had been missing for so long. She looked up as he entered, offering a small smile before returning to her work. Jackson poured himself coffee and sat at the table, watching her hands shape the dough with practiced ease. Morning light was just beginning to paint the window panes with pale fire, and in that quiet moment, he felt something inside him shift and settle, like ice breaking up in spring. Here was a rhythm he'd forgotten could exist, the shared silence of early morning, the simple comfort of another person's presence, the way light could fill a room differently when it wasn't falling on emptiness. He found himself remembering how to be part of something larger than his solitude, remembering what it meant to belong. Layla began to hum as she worked, another of those old hymns that seemed to live in her heart. Without meaning to, Jackson found himself humming along, the melody coming back to him like water finding its old course. When he realized what he was doing, he stopped abruptly, but not before catching the surprised pleasure in Layla's eyes. She said nothing, just smiled, and continued her work. But something had changed in that moment. Some wall had softened. Some distance had shrunk. The morning light grew stronger, filling the cabin with gold, and with it came a sense of possibility neither of them was quite ready to name. A blanket of white descended over the mountain, transforming Jackson's homestead into a winter sanctuary. For 7 days straight, snow drifted down in gentle waves, coating pine boughs and smoothing the rugged landscape into soft curves. Inside the cabin, Layla watched through frosted window panes, learning to read the mountain's changing moods in the way Jackson had taught her. "See how the clouds hang low?" he'd explained one morning, pointing to the heavy gray sky. "Storm's got more to give yet." His words were few but patient, and Layla found herself treasuring these rare moments of instruction. The smokehouse became her next lesson. Jackson showed her how to maintain the delicate balance of heat and smoke needed to preserve meat for the winter months. Her first attempt left the venison too dry, but he'd eaten it without complaint, and by the 4th try, she'd mastered the technique. "You're getting the feel of it," he'd said, examining a strip of perfectly cured meat. Coming from Jackson, it felt like high praise indeed. The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Layla rose before dawn to kindle the fire and prepare breakfast. Jackson would return from his morning checks of the trap lines, snow crusting his coat and beard. They'd share coffee and companionable silence, watching the sun paint the white world in shades of gold. But it was during the evening of the 7th day that everything changed. Layla was searching for spare candles as the early winter darkness crept in. Jackson had mentioned keeping extras under his bed, and she'd waited until he'd gone to check on the mules before looking. As she reached beneath the bed frame, her hand struck something solid, a small wooden chest, its surface smooth with age. She didn't mean to disturb it, truly, but as she shifted it slightly to reach behind it, the lid creaked open, revealing its contents in the fading light. Among various papers and photographs lay an envelope that caught her eye, official-looking, yellowed with age, and stamped with bold red letters spelling out "Confidential." The seal of the United States Army was clearly visible in one corner. Lost in contemplation of this discovery, Layla didn't hear Jackson's return until his shadow fell across the doorway. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as his eyes fixed on the envelope in her hands. "Put that back." His voice was harder than she'd ever heard it, stripped of all the warmth that had grown between them over the past weeks. "Some things are best left buried." Shame flooded through her as she carefully returned the envelope to its resting place. "I'm sorry. I was just looking for candles." Don't." The word cut through her explanation like a knife through butter. Jackson turned and walked out, leaving the cabin door open behind him. Cold air rushed in, making the flames in the hearth dance wildly. Layla's hands trembled as she closed the chest and slid it back under the bed. The comfortable peace they'd built felt suddenly fragile, like spring ice over a deep river. She moved through the cabin in a daze, straightening things that didn't need straightening, trying to busy her hands while her mind whirled with questions she knew she had no right to ask. As night settled fully over the mountain, she could see Jackson's silhouette through the window. He sat on the chopping block, unmoving, while snow drifted down to dust his shoulders and beard with white. The sight of him there, alone in the cold and dark, made her heart ache. Kneeling by the hearth, Layla clasped her hands together and bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, "grant me wisdom. Show me how to help without prying, how to offer comfort without overstepping." The fire crackled softly, like a gentle answer to her prayers. Outside, Jackson sat perfectly still, but his mind was anything but quiet. The sight of that envelope had ripped open wounds he'd thought long scarred over. He could hear Captain Morrison's voice as clearly as if it were yesterday. "These are your orders, Scout Grant. That village is harboring hostiles. Burn it out." The memories came in waves. The peaceful Apache settlement they'd been tracking, the women cooking morning meals, children playing in the dust. He'd seen no signs of the raiders they were hunting, no weapons beyond those needed for hunting. He'd tried to argue, to buy time, but orders were orders. That night, he'd deserted. Left his uniform folded neat as you please, with his letter of resignation pinned to it. He couldn't be part of such things, wouldn't carry out orders that went against everything he believed was right. But the guilt of not doing more, not speaking up sooner, not finding some way to prevent what happened after he left, that had followed him up into these mountains like a shadow he couldn't shake. Through the window, he could see Layla moving about the cabin. The warm lamplight caught her figure as she worked, and something in his chest tightened at the sight. She'd brought such gentle grace to his rough existence, never pushing, never demanding. Even now, when curiosity must be eating at her, she respected his silence. The sound of the cabin door opening drew his attention. Layla stood in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She didn't speak, didn't try to coax him in. She simply set one mug on the stump beside him and retreated back inside, leaving the door open in quiet invitation. The coffee's warmth seeped into his cold hands as he lifted the mug. Through the window, he could see Layla sitting in her usual spot by the fire, her own mug cradled in her hands, her eyes fixed on the flames. No judgment, no pressure, just patient companionship offered freely. After a long moment, Jackson stood, brushing snow from his clothes. Inside, the warmth of the cabin embraced him like a physical thing. He took his place in the chair opposite Layla, and together they sat in silence, sipping their coffee as the fire crackled between them. No words were spoken that night, but something shifted in the quiet. The tension gradually eased, replaced by understanding that ran deeper than words. Layla's quiet acceptance of his boundaries, her wordless offer of comfort. These things spoke louder than any questions she might have asked. As the fire burned low, Jackson finally stirred from his thoughts. Looking across at Layla, he saw that she had dozed off in her chair, her empty coffee mug still clutched in her hands. The sight stirred something protective in his chest, something he'd thought long dead. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he took the mug from her hands and covered her with his late wife's quilt. She murmured something in her sleep, but didn't wake. Standing there in the dying firelight, Jackson realized that while the past might still haunt him, perhaps it didn't have to define his future. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in pristine white, while inside the cabin, two souls found their way through the dark, one patient moment at a time. The mountain winter tightened its grip on the land, bringing deeper snows and longer nights. Morning found Jackson in the cabin's doorway, watching Layla struggle with the leather straps of her borrowed snowshoes. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated, reminding him of a child learning to tie bootlaces. "Like this," he said, kneeling beside her. His calloused hands moved with practiced ease, showing her how to secure the bindings. "Too loose and you'll lose them in deep snow. Too tight and your feet go numb." Lexa nodded, memorizing his movements. "I reckon there's a lesson in that somewhere," she said, eyes twinkling. "Finding the right balance and such." The corners of Jackson's mouth twitched. "Reckon so?" They set out across the pristine snow, Jackson leading the way toward his trapline. Boone bounded ahead, leaving deep paw prints in the powder. The morning air was crisp and clean, their breath forming little clouds that disappeared into the crystalline sky. Layla's first steps were tentative, like a newborn colt finding its legs. She wobbled, arms windmilling as she sought her balance. "Oh!" she exclaimed, taking a few successful steps. "I think I'm getting the hang of—" Her words cut off as she pitched forward, face planting into a snowdrift. For a moment, Jackson's heart stopped. Then he heard her muffled giggling. She rolled over, face covered in snow, laughing like a schoolgirl. The sound echoed off the mountainside, pure and joyful. Something loosened in Jackson's chest, and before he knew it, a low chuckle escaped him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. The sound surprised them both, and Layla's eyes widened with delight. "Why, Jackson Grant," she said, accepting his offered hand up. "I do believe that's the first time I've heard you laugh." He ducked his head, suddenly self-conscious, but the warmth in his chest remained. They continued along the trail, Layla growing more confident with each step. Jackson found himself pointing out signs she might have missed, rabbit tracks crossing their path, the distinctive mark of an owl's wings in the snow where it had swooped down for prey. As they climbed higher, the wind picked up, carrying ice crystals that sparkled in the sunlight. Jackson's expression grew serious as they passed beneath a towering rock face. "See that clearing down there?" He pointed to a space between the trees. 10 years back, an avalanche buried 3 men there, trappers like me. Nature don't care how prepared you think you are. Layla's face softened with compassion. "Did you know them?" "One." His voice grew distant. "Good man. Left a wife and 2 little ones down in Denver." He paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes I wonder if that's not better than what I did, leaving people behind while still walking this earth." The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. They walked in silence for a while, the squeak of snow beneath their feet the only sound. Finally, Layla spoke, her voice gentle as a summer breeze. "My pa used to say that regret's like a heavy pack. You can carry it forever, or you can set it down and learn from the journey it took you on." Jackson glanced at her, something shifting in his gray eyes. "Your pa sounds like a wise man." "He was," she said simply. His faith saw him through some mighty dark times. "Faith," Jackson echoed, testing the word like an unfamiliar tool. "Lost mine somewhere between here and Mexico. Saw too much that didn't make sense." They checked the trap line. In comfortable silence, Layla helping to reset the triggers with increasingly steady hands. The sun was low when they returned to the cabin, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Over a supper of rabbit stew and cornbread, Jackson seemed to come to some internal decision. "I served," he said suddenly, stirring his stew. "In the army. Scout and tracker, mostly." He took a deep breath, left when the killing stopped making sense, when orders and conscience couldn't live together anymore. Layla looked up from her bowl, her eyes full of understanding but asking no questions. Her silence seemed to give him strength. Some things a man can't do, not even under orders, not and still call himself a man of God. He fell quiet then, and Layla didn't press him further. The next week, they hitched up the mule sled for a supply run to Silver Bend. The town had grown quieter with winter's arrival, most folks staying close to their hearths. Jackson loaded his furs while Layla traded for flour and coffee at the general store, her confidence growing with each transaction. They were nearly finished when a shadow darkened the store's doorway. A tall man entered, his tin star catching the winter light. The United States Marshal's presence seemed to fill the small space, his keen eyes scanning the room before settling on Jackson. "Been a while since I seen a man handle furs like that," the Marshal said, his voice casual but intent. "Reminds me of some scouts I knew under Colonel Harlan. You ever serve with him? Down around Apache Wells?" Jackson's face revealed nothing, but Layla saw his shoulders tense. "Can't say I recall," he said evenly. "Lot of colonels in the Army." The Marshal, Dodd, by the name on his introduction, studied Jackson's face. "Funny thing about memory," he said. "Some things stick with you, whether you want them to or not." "Indeed they do," Jackson replied, his voice cooling. "If you'll excuse us, Marshal, long ride home ahead." They left quickly, Jackson's movements sharp and controlled as he secured their supplies. Layla felt the change in him, like a storm gathering in the mountains. As they drove out of town, she saw the Marshal watching them from the telegraph office steps, his expression unreadable. The ride home was silent, broken only by the creaking of the sled runners and the mules' steady breathing. Layla's heart ached for the new tension in Jackson's bearing, the way his eyes constantly scanned the trail behind them. That night, after he'd gone to check the stock, she knelt by her bed and prayed with renewed fervor. "Lord," she whispered, "whatever burden he carries, whatever storm is coming, please give him strength, and give me wisdom to help him bear it." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering their tracks back to town. But Layla knew some tracks couldn't be covered so easily. Whatever Jackson's past held, it was catching up to him, and all she could do was pray it wouldn't destroy the peace he'd found in these mountains. She glanced out the window to where Jackson stood in the barn doorway, his figure dark against the lantern light. The past might be coming for him, but he wasn't alone anymore. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the cabin's shutters and driving snow through every tiny crack. Layla pulled her shawl tighter as she stoked the fire, grateful for the sturdy walls around them. 3 days now, the blizzard had raged, turning the world outside into a white fury. Jackson sat at the rough-hewn table, his weathered hands working methodically over his traps with a file. The steady scraping sound mingled with the storm's roar. Boone lay curled by the hearth, occasionally lifting his head at particularly fierce gusts. Layla's fingers traced the worn leather cover of the Bible she'd found on Jackson's shelf. She'd been reading aloud each evening, her clear voice carrying over the storm's fury. Today she opened to Psalms, finding comfort in the ancient words. "The Lord is merciful and gracious," she read, "slow to anger, and plenteous in mercy." The familiar verses filled the cabin's warmth. "He hath not dealt with us after our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities." The scraping of Jackson's file slowed, then stopped. Layla glanced up to find him staring into the fire, his face carved with shadows. She continued reading, but her voice softened when she noticed his hands had begun to tremble. "Reckon that's enough reading for now," he said roughly, setting down his file. The wind outside had temporarily calmed, leaving an unusual quiet in the cabin. Layla closed the Bible gently. "Do you believe in mercy, Jackson?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes still fixed on the dancing flames. "Used to," he said finally. "Before the war. Before—" His voice trailed off. "Before what?" she asked softly. Jackson's shoulders tensed, then sagged, as if a great weight was settling onto them. "Before I became the kind of man who needs more mercy than he deserves." Layla waited, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. Outside, the wind began to rise again, but inside the cabin remained still, as if holding its breath. "It was down near the Mexican border," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Apache village. They'd already surrendered. Women, children, old folks, no warriors left." His hands clenched on the table. "Colonel gave the order to burn it, said we couldn't spare the men to guard them, couldn't risk them joining other bands." Layla's hand flew to her mouth, but she remained silent, watching as Jackson wrestled with the memory. "I can still hear them screaming," he continued, his voice rough. "Can still smell the smoke. Some of the men were laughing, Layla, laughing while people burned." His hands were shaking harder now. "I walked away that night, just mounted up and rode north, didn't stop till I hit these mountains. Been trying to forget ever since, but seems like the Lord ain't willing to let me." The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Layla rose slowly from her chair and moved to the table. Without hesitation, she reached out and took his trembling hands in hers. "Then start over here," she said softly, her voice steady and sure. "The Lord gives second chances, Jackson. That's what mercy means." He stared at their joined hands, his calloused fingers engulfed by her smaller ones. "How can you say that, knowing what I done?" "Because I believe in grace," she replied simply, "and because I see the man you are now, the man who defended a stranger's dignity, who shares his home with the lost, who treats God's creatures with gentleness." Tears gathered in Jackson's eyes, though none fell. Slowly, his hands steadied in hers. They sat in silence as the storm raged outside, but something had shifted between them, a trust born of shared pain and understanding. The blizzard finally broke 3 days later, leaving the world transformed under a blanket of fresh snow. Layla stood at the cabin door, breathing in the crisp air and watching the sun sparkle on untouched drifts. Jackson was in the barn, checking on the animals after the long confinement. Movement caught her eye, something dark against the white expanse near the tree line. At first she thought it might be a fallen branch, but then she saw it move again. "Jackson!" she called, already pulling on her coat. As she drew closer, her heart nearly stopped. There, half buried in the snow, lay a small body. She ran the last few steps, dropping to her knees beside the figure. It was a boy, no more than 10 years old, his black hair frozen with ice. His skin burned with fever despite the cold, and his breaths came in shallow gasps. She recognized the traditional clothing. He was Apache. Jackson's boots crunched in the snow behind her. "Layla, get back from there." "Help me carry him inside," she interrupted, already trying to lift the child. "He's burning up." "We can't," Jackson said sharply. "Folks'll think we're harboring Indians. You don't know what kind of trouble that could bring." Layla turned to him, the boy cradled against her chest. "I know exactly what kind of trouble it could bring, and I know what kind of trouble it will bring my soul if I leave this child to die." Her eyes met his, unflinching. "You want a second chance, Jackson? Here it is." Something flickered in his face, pain, memory, fear. But then his jaw set. Without another word, he stepped forward and lifted the boy easily in his arms. Together, they carried him into the cabin's warmth. Layla worked quickly, stripping off the boy's frozen clothes while Jackson built up the fire. She wrapped him in blankets and began heating water for willow bark tea. The child's skin was hot to the touch, his breathing labored. "He's been out there at least a day," Jackson said, examining the boy's cracked lips and sunken eyes. "Probably got separated from his people in the storm." "Then God led him to us," Layla replied firmly, wringing out a cool cloth to lay on the child's forehead. "Hand me that honey from the shelf. We need to get some strength back in him." Jackson watched her work, his face troubled. "Taking in a strange child is one thing. Taking in an Apache boy—" He shook his head. "The town won't understand." "Then they don't need to know," Layla said, carefully spooning honey-sweetened tea between the boy's lips. "Not until he's well enough to travel." She looked up at Jackson, her eyes gentle but determined. "Sometimes doing right means standing against what others think is proper." Jackson's hand went unconsciously to the chest where he kept his army letter. "Reckon I learned that lesson the hard way," he said quietly. The boy stirred, mumbling words in Apache that neither of them understood. Layla hummed softly, the same hymn she'd been singing since she arrived, as she continued tending to him. Jackson stood watching, his face a battlefield of emotions, fear warring with duty, past guilt meeting present chance for redemption. Finally, he moved to the door, checking that the barn was secure for the night. When he returned, he brought extra blankets and began making up a pallet near the fire. "We'll need to keep him warm," he said gruffly. "Fever or no, the cold's still in his bones." Layla smiled, recognizing the decision in his actions. "Thank you," she said softly. Jackson just nodded, but his eyes held a new light, something like hope, or perhaps the first fragile shoots of healing. Together they settled in to watch over their unexpected guest, while outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering all traces of the boy's arrival at their door. The boy's fever burned like a wildfire through the night. Layla wrung out another cool cloth and pressed it against his forehead, her own exhaustion forgotten in the urgency of his care. The cabin's single room glowed with lamplight as she worked, her shadow dancing against the log walls. "Here now," she whispered, supporting the boy's head while offering a spoonful of broth. "Just a little more, child." Jackson stood by the hearth, his broad frame tense as he watched them. The boy's presence had stirred something in him, memories he'd tried to bury beneath years of mountain silence. His eyes fixed on the intricate beadwork adorning the child's shirt, which lay carefully folded on a nearby chair. The pattern was unmistakable, blue and white diamonds interwoven with copper-colored threads. His throat tightened as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "I know these markings," he said, his voice rough. "From the village near Mesa Creek." He didn't need to say more. They both knew which village he meant. Layla glanced up at him, noting the pain etched across his features. "Then helping him now matters even more," she said softly. Jackson moved closer, kneeling beside the makeshift bed. With hands that had once brought destruction to this boy's people, he now helped Layla steady the child as she spooned more broth between his cracked lips. The guilt twisted in his chest like a knife, but he didn't pull away. The boy stirred, his eyes fluttering beneath closed lids. "Naicha," he whispered, the word barely audible. "Naicha." Layla touched Jackson's arm. "He's been saying that word over and over. What does it mean?" "It's a name," Jackson replied, his voice hollow with memory. "Means protected one in Apache. Must be his mother." Boone, Jackson's faithful wolfhound, had taken up position at the foot of the boy's pallet. The dog's gray head rested on his paws, but his eyes remained alert, watching over their small patient with surprising gentleness. When the boy would stir or moan, Boone would lift his head and whine softly until Layla soothed the child back to rest. Hours stretched into days. Layla refused to leave the boy's side, catching only brief moments of sleep in the chair beside him. Jackson brought her coffee and tried to convince her to rest properly, but she just shook her head. "I can't leave him," she said, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "What if his fever spikes again? What if he needs water?" Jackson watched her tender care with a mixture of admiration and worry. "You can't help him if you make yourself sick," he argued, but there was no heat in his words. He understood the need to make things right, even in small ways. They fell into a rhythm, Layla tending the boy while Jackson maintained their necessary routines. He checked his trap lines, cared for the animals, and kept the cabin supplied with wood and water. But he found himself spending more time inside, helping Layla prepare willow bark tea or simply sitting nearby, watching the slow rise and fall of the boy's chest. On the fourth night, something changed. The boy's breathing eased, and his skin grew cooler to the touch. Layla, dozing in her chair, woke to find him sleeping peacefully for the first time since they'd found him. "Jackson?" she called softly. "Come feel his forehead." Jackson crossed the room in 2 long strides, laying his calloused hand gently on the boy's brow. "Fever's broken," he confirmed, relief evident in his voice. Their eyes met over the sleeping child, sharing a moment of quiet joy. Layla's smile was tired but bright, and Jackson felt something warm unfurl in his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. But morning brought a harsh reminder of the world beyond their cabin. Jackson was outside checking the smokehouse when he heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats on the ridge. He moved quickly to the edge of the clearing, using the trees for cover as he scanned the slope above. A lone rider moved along the ridgeline, pausing occasionally to study the valley below. Even at this distance, Jackson could make out the glint of a badge on the man's chest. His heart sank as he recognized the marshal's bay horse. He slipped back to the cabin, entering quietly to avoid, waking the boy who still slept near the hearth. Layla looked up from her mending, noting his troubled expression. "What is it?" she whispered. Jackson moved to the window, carefully peering through a gap in the shutters. "Marshall's back," he said, cursing softly. "Word in Silver Bend is he's asking about deserters, specifically ones who served under Colonel Harlan." Layla's hands stilled in her lap. "The colonel who ordered—" "Yes," Jackson cut her off, not wanting to speak the words. "Same one." "He can't know you're here," Layla said, but uncertainty threaded through her voice. "Maybe not yet." Jackson ran a hand through his beard. "But he's persistent. Won't take him long to start asking about mountain men who keep to themselves." The boy stirred on his pallet, drawing both their attention. He looked peaceful now, his fever gone, but his presence complicated an already dangerous situation. Harboring an Apache child while being hunted as a deserter, Jackson couldn't imagine a worse combination. Layla seemed to read his thoughts. "We'll protect him," she said firmly. "And you too. God didn't lead us all together just to abandon us now." Jackson wanted to argue, to point out the foolishness of such faith in the face of hard reality. But watching Layla tend to the boy with such gentle determination, he found he couldn't form the words. Instead, he moved to the door. "I'll check the back trail," he said gruffly. "Make sure no one's been up this way recently." Layla nodded, already reaching for her shawl. "I'll keep watch here. If anyone comes—" "Hide the boy in the root cellar," Jackson finished. "There's a space behind the potato bins." Their eyes met briefly, sharing an understanding born of shared purpose and growing trust. Then Jackson slipped out into the morning light, his thoughts churning like storm clouds. The marshal's presence meant their peaceful isolation was ending. Soon, he knew, he would have to face the consequences of his past choices. But watching Layla through the window as she smoothed the blanket over their sleeping charge, Jackson felt something shift inside him. Maybe facing those consequences wouldn't mean facing them alone. Boone padded silently beside him as he checked the trails, the wolfhound's nose working the wind for any strange scents. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day that usually brought Jackson peace. Now, though, every snapping twig and rustling branch set his nerves on edge. From the ridge above came the faint echo of hoofbeats, growing fainter as the marshal moved on. But Jackson knew it was only temporary. In a territory this wild, a man with a badge and a mission would keep searching until he found what he was looking for. When he returned to the cabin, Layla had breakfast waiting, cornbread and coffee, with a thin porridge cooling for the boy. She didn't ask about what he'd found on his patrol, and he didn't offer the information. Instead, they ate in companionable silence, broken only by Boone's contented sighs as he settled back into his guard position by the boy's bed. The boy slept on, his breathing deep and regular, unaware of the storm gathering around him. Jackson watched him for a long moment, remembering another child from years ago, one he hadn't been able to save. This time, he promised silently, would be different. 2 days passed like whispers in the mountain air. The cabin settled into an odd rhythm, normal on the surface but thrumming with secrets underneath. Every movement became a careful dance of protection and pretense. Jackson and Layla maintained their usual routines while harboring their young charge in the smokehouse loft, a space Jackson had hastily cleaned and lined with old quilts. During daylight hours, the cabin felt emptier for the boy's absence. Layla kept glancing toward the window, her hands busy with cooking or mending, but her thoughts clearly drifting to their hidden guest. Jackson worked his trap lines as usual, though he adjusted his routes to keep closer watch on the approaches to their property. Nightfall brought relief and renewed purpose. As soon as darkness settled over the mountains, they would carry food and fresh water to the smokehouse. The boy's eyes would light up at their arrival, his smile breaking through any language barriers between them. Layla spent these precious evening hours teaching him simple English words, starting with please and thank you. She showed him how to fold his hands and bow his head, whispering prayers in soft tones that seemed to soothe him. The boy would mimic her gestures, his dark eyes serious as he formed the unfamiliar words. Our Father, Layla would say slowly, and he would echo back, the words strange but earnest on his tongue. Jackson found his own way to connect with the child. He brought small blocks of pine wood and his carving knife, showing the boy how to whittle simple shapes. The boy proved to be a quick study, his small hands careful with the blade, as Jackson taught him to always cut away from himself. Like this, Jackson would demonstrate, his large hands guiding the boy's smaller ones. Gentle now. Let the wood tell you what it wants to be. Together they created rough-hewn animals, horses, wolves, and birds that grew more detailed with each attempt. The boy would beam with pride at each completed figure, carefully arranging them along the edge of his makeshift bed in the loft. These quiet moments felt almost peaceful, as if they could preserve this delicate balance forever. But Jackson knew better. Every morning brought fresh anxiety. Every unexpected sound caused them all to freeze in place, hearts pounding. Boone proved invaluable as their sentry. The wolfhound kept constant vigil, his keen senses alert to any approach. His low growls had warned them twice of passing riders, giving them time to ensure all traces of the boy were hidden. On the evening of the second day, they were sharing their usual nighttime visit in the smokehouse, when Boone's growl cut through the quiet. This wasn't his usual warning rumble. This was deeper, more urgent. Jackson's hand went instinctively to his rifle as he moved to the smokehouse door. Through the gathering dusk, 3 figures emerged from the tree line. 2 men and a woman, their movements fluid and purposeful. They wore Apache clothing, and the woman's bearing spoke of determination and barely contained emotion. "Nietzsche!" The boy's whispered exclamation confirmed what Jackson's pounding heart already knew. This was the mother, come to claim her son. Layla didn't hesitate. Before Jackson could stop her, she was hurrying across the yard, her hands raised in peaceful greeting. The approaching Apache slowed but didn't stop, their eyes fixed on her with careful assessment. "Welcome," Layla called softly. "Your son is here. He's safe." The woman, Nietzsche, stepped forward. Her face bore the same quiet strength Jackson remembered from that terrible day years ago, when he'd been a different man following orders he knew were wrong. His hands began to shake as the memories flooded back. Layla gestured towards the smokehouse, and the boy came running out, crossing the space between them in joyful bounds. Nietzsche caught him in her arms, pulling him close as she murmured rapid Apache words of relief and love. The 2 men with her maintained their watchful stance, but some of the tension eased from their shoulders at this reunion. Jackson stood rooted in place, his past and present colliding with devastating force. He recognized every detail of Nietzsche's face, the same face he'd seen in firelight years ago when his unit had descended on their village, the same face that had haunted his dreams ever since. Something in him broke. Moving forward on unsteady legs, Jackson began to speak in halting Apache, words he'd learned during his army years and never thought he'd use again. "I was there," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The night of fire. I wore blue coat. I did not stop them." His vocabulary was limited, but his meaning was clear. Nietzsche lifted her head, her son still held close against her. She studied Jackson's face for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The 2 men with her shifted, hands moving toward weapons, but she held up a hand to stop them. "I remember you," she said in careful English. "You turned away. You left after." Jackson nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Nietzsche looked down at her son, then at Layla, taking in the evidence of their care, his clean clothes, his healthy color, the wooden carvings clutched in his hands. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of judgment and mercy combined. "You protect life now," she said. "This is how you make right. You are forgiven if you continue this path." The simple pronouncement staggered Jackson more than any punishment could have. Tears he'd held back for years burned in his eyes as the burden of his guilt began to transform into something new, a purpose, a chance to protect instead of destroy. Layla, sensing the profound nature of this moment, suggested they share a meal. She disappeared into the cabin and returned with venison stew she'd been keeping warm, along with cornbread and dried berries. They sat together under the darkening sky, this unlikely gathering of souls connected by fate and forgiveness. The meal was quiet, punctuated by simple exchanges in mixed English and Apache. The 2 men, who Nietzsche introduced as her brothers, gradually relaxed enough to accept second helpings of stew. The boy moved between his mother and Layla, his happiness bridging any awkwardness in their circle. Boone settled nearby, his earlier growls forgotten as he accepted bits of meat from the boy's careful hands. The wolfhound's acceptance of their guests seemed to seal the strange peace of the evening. As they ate, Jackson watched Nietzsche with her son, saw how she smoothed his hair and checked him for any signs of harm. Her love was fierce and protective, yet she showed no anger toward those who had sheltered him. Instead, she listened as the boy excitedly showed her his wooden carvings, nodding at his broken mixture of Apache and English words. The meal took on an almost sacred quality. Enemies turned friends, breaking bread together under the vast Colorado sky. The fire cast dancing shadows on their faces, highlighting both their differences and their shared humanity. Here was proof that wounds could heal, that new paths could be forged from the ashes of the past. Morning dawned crisp and clear over the mountain cabin. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, transforming the landscape into a pristine blanket of white. Layla wrapped her worn shawl tighter as she and Jackson prepared for their trip into Silver Bend. They needed supplies, and Jackson had furs to trade at the general store. "We won't be gone long," Layla assured Nietzsche, who had remained hidden with her family in the smokehouse. The Apache woman nodded, understanding the necessity of secrecy. Jackson secured the last bundle of furs onto the mule-drawn sled. His movements were precise but tense, betraying the worry that had settled over him since Nietzsche's arrival. Boone whined softly, picking up on his master's unease. "Stay," Jackson commanded the wolfhound. "Guard." The dog sat obediently by the cabin door, his intelligent eyes following them as they set off down the snowy trail. The journey to town was mostly silent. Layla watched Jackson's broad shoulders, noting how they grew more rigid with each step closer to Silver Bend. The morning sun cast long shadows across their path, and their breath clouded in the cold air. As they approached the outskirts of town, the first whispers reached them. Two women outside the millinery shop stopped their conversation abruptly, eyes following Layla and Jackson as they passed. Near the livery stable, a group of men huddled together, their voices dropping to conspiratorial murmurs. "Indian child up at the trapper's cabin? Heard from Jenkins who was hunting up there. Saw smoke from their fire." Layla's heart quickened, but she kept her face calm, remembering her mother's advice about dignity in the face of gossip. Jackson walked beside her, his expression unchanged, though she noticed his hand tighten on the sled's rope. They reached Whitaker's general store, where Jackson began unloading his furs. The shopkeeper's usual friendly manner seemed subdued, his eyes darting between them and the street outside. As he counted out payment for the pelts, the store's bell jangled. Marshal Curtis Dodd filled the doorway, his tin star catching the morning light. Two deputies flanked him, hands resting casually on their gun belts, the marshal's keen eyes fixed on Jackson, who straightened slowly from his work. "Mr. Grant," Dodd said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Might I have a word?" Jackson nodded once, following the marshal to a quiet corner of the store. Layla busied herself selecting supplies, but her ears strained to catch their conversation. "Army's still looking to account for all its deserters," Dodd said, just loud enough for Layla to hear. "Interesting thing about deserters, they often carry guilt that makes them help others running from the law." "I'm a free man," Jackson replied evenly, though Layla could hear the slight tremor in his voice. "Living quiet and keeping to myself." "Are you now?" The marshal's tone grew harder. "Because we've had reports of smoke from your cabin, more than one man would make, and some interesting visitors in the night." Jackson met the marshal's gaze steadily. "My business is my own, Marshal." "Not when it involves harboring fugitives, it ain't." Dodd stepped closer. "The Army takes desertion seriously, Mr. Grant. Or should I say Private Grant?" Layla saw fear flash in Jackson's eyes before he masked it. Her heart ached for him, knowing the weight of his past pressing down harder with each of the marshal's words. They finished their business quickly after that, loading their purchased supplies onto the sled. The walk home felt heavier than the journey in, watched by too many curious eyes. Jackson's shoulders remained taut as a drawn bowstring. That evening, after securing the smokehouse and ensuring Nietzsche's family had food and blankets, Layla found Jackson sitting at the cabin's rough-hewn table, his head bowed. Without a word, she lit the oil lamp and opened the Bible that had become their nightly comfort. "Would you pray with me?" she asked softly. Jackson looked up, surprise and vulnerability warring in his expression. After a moment, he nodded. Layla reached across the table and took his calloused hand in hers. "Dear Lord," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "We ask for courage to face what comes. Guide us in your wisdom and—" A sharp knock cut through her words like a gunshot. "Jackson Grant!" Marshal Dodds. Marshal Hine. Voice carried clearly through the cabin door. "Come out here!" Jackson squeezed Layla's hand once before releasing it. Rising slowly, he moved to the window and peered through a gap in the shutters. The marshal and 2 deputies stood in the yard, their horses stamping in the snow behind them. All 3 men carried rifles. "We're searching for a wounded Apache," Dodd called out, "and a runaway soldier who might be helping them." Layla joined Jackson at the window, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the lawman outside must hear it. The marshal's face was stern in the gathering dusk, his breath frosting in the cold air as he waited for a response. Jackson's hand found the door latch. "Stay inside," he whispered to Layla. "No." She gripped his arm. "We face this together." When they stepped onto the porch, the deputies raised their rifles slightly. Marshal Dodd held up a hand, stopping them. "Marshal," Jackson said quietly, "I reckon you already know who I am." "I do now." Dodd's eyes were hard. "Private Jackson Grant, deserter from the 7th Cavalry 4 years ago, after the Apache campaign." Layla moved forward, placing herself between Jackson and the lawman. Her voice shook but held firm. "Please, Marshal, there doesn't need to be violence here." "Ma'am, step aside," Dodd ordered. "This man's wanted by the army." "Then let him surrender properly," Layla pleaded. "At dawn. Give him that dignity at least." She met the marshal's gaze steadily. "You're a man of law, not a murderer in the night." Something flickered in Dodd's expression. Perhaps recognition of her courage, or memory of his own humanity. The silence stretched taut as a fiddle string. Finally, the marshal lowered his rifle slightly. "Dawn," he agreed. "But hear me clear, Grant. You try to run, I'll shoot. No questions asked." Jackson nodded once, his voice rough but clear. "I understand." They watched the lawman mount up and ride away, their horses' hooves muffled by the snow. When they were gone, Layla turned to Jackson, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "You can't stay," she whispered. "They'll send you to prison." But Jackson's face held a strange peace. "No more running," he said softly. "Maybe this is how I make things right." They stood together on the porch, watching darkness settle over the mountains. Tomorrow would bring judgment, but for now, they had this moment of quiet courage and shared faith. Inside the cabin, they could hear Boone's soft whine, a reminder of all they had built together in this place. Jackson reached for Layla's hand, and she took it, their fingers intertwining in silent support as they faced the long night ahead. Dawn painted the mountains in shades of pearl and gold, but its beauty brought no comfort to the cabin. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the scent of fresh snow and pine. Inside, Layla moved quietly, preparing a last breakfast neither of them would eat. Jackson stood at the window, watching the sun climb over the ridgeline. He'd barely slept, spending most of the night writing letters, one to the fort commander explaining his actions, another to Layla that he folded and tucked beneath his Bible. His movements were deliberate, peaceful even, like a man who had finally found his path after years of wandering. "It's time," he said softly, turning from the window. Layla nodded, unable to trust her voice. She watched as Jackson pulled on his heavy coat and wrapped his scarf, the one she'd mended, around his neck. His hands moved with careful purpose as he gathered his few possessions, leaving his rifle propped beside the door. Outside, his horse stamped restlessly in the fresh powder, breath streaming in the cold. Jackson checked the cinch, then turned to face Layla. In the crystalline morning light, she could see every line etched in his weathered face, every fleck of gray in his beard. "The marshal will be here soon," he said. "Best make this quick." Layla reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small wooden cross, no bigger than her palm. Jackson had carved it himself during their long winter evenings, his knife moving carefully over the pine as she read from scripture. Now she pressed it into his rough hand. "To remember?" she whispered. Jackson's fingers closed around the cross. For a moment, his stern expression softened, and Layla glimpsed the tender heart he'd hidden for so long. Without warning, he pulled her into an embrace, his arms strong and sure around her. Layla buried her face in his coat, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair, "for showing me what mercy looks like." The sound of approaching horses broke their moment. Jackson stepped back, squeezing her hand once before letting go. Marshal Dodd appeared first through the trees, followed by his deputies. Their breath and their horses clouded the air as they drew up in front of the cabin. "Morning, Grant," Dodd called out, his voice carrying in the still air. "I see you made the right choice." Jackson nodded, already walking toward them. "A man's word ought to mean something." The marshal dismounted, shackles clinking at his saddle. "Hands out," he ordered, though his tone held a hint of respect. Layla watched, her heart breaking, as the cold iron closed around Jackson's wrists. He didn't flinch, didn't resist. The morning sun caught the marshal's badge as he secured the chains, a flash of light like judgment itself. "Mount up," Dodd commanded. One of the deputies brought forward a spare horse for Jackson. Before climbing into the saddle, Jackson turned one last time toward the cabin. His eyes met Layla's, and in them she saw not defeat, but a kind of peace. He'd found his way to redemption, even if it led through prison bars. The small party turned their horses toward Fort Garland, snow beginning to swirl around them. Layla stood in the road, watching until they disappeared into the white silence of the mountains. She barely noticed the cold tears freezing on her cheeks. A soft sound behind her made her turn. Nietzsche and her son stood at the edge of the trees, having appeared as silently as spirits. The boy clutched his mother's hand, his dark eyes solemn. Nietzsche stepped forward, her moccasins leaving no mark in the snow, and placed a gentle hand on Layla's shoulder. "We will not forget," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of a sacred promise. Layla covered Nietzsche's hand with her own, drawing strength from the touch. "Neither will I." That evening, after Nietzsche and her son had returned to their hidden camp, Layla sat at Jackson's table and began to write. The lamp burned low as she poured her heart onto paper, pleading Jackson's case to the fort commander. She wrote of his kindness, his protection of the innocent, his journey from guilt to grace. Her tears sometimes blurred the ink, but her hand remained steady. "Dear Colonel Harrison," she wrote, "I write to you not as a judge, but as one who has witnessed the transformation of a good man's soul." She wrote until the lamp guttered, filling 4 pages with her earnest defense. As she signed her name at the bottom, she felt a surge of purpose. This letter would not be enough, she knew that, but it was a beginning. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Layla moved with quiet determination, packing supplies onto Jackson's mule. She filled the saddlebags with food, blankets, and medical supplies, knowing the journey to Fort Garland would not be easy. Boone watched her preparations, whining softly. "Stay," she told the wolfhound, scratching behind his ears. "Guard the cabin for us." She had no map, no real knowledge of the way to the fort, but she had faith, and she had the sun, and she had the mountains themselves to guide her. Jackson had taught her enough about reading the land that she felt confident she could follow their trail. Nietzsche appeared as Layla was mounting up, emerging from the shadows of the pines like a ghost. She carried a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. "Medicine," she explained, handing it up to Layla, "for the journey, and for him." Layla accepted the gift with gratitude, tucking it carefully into her saddlebag. "Thank you," she said, meaning it for far more than just the medicine. Nietzsche nodded, understanding in her eyes. The Great Spirit guides those who seek justice with a pure heart. The words settled over Layla like a blessing. She adjusted her shawl against the morning chill and turned the mule's head toward the trail. Behind her, the cabin stood silent in its snowy clearing, smoke rising straight and true from the chimney into the crystalline sky. Faith, she reminded herself, was stronger than fear. Love was stronger than iron chains. And mercy, as Jackson had finally learned, was stronger than guilt. With these truths to guide her, she urged the mule forward, leaving familiar ground for the unknown path ahead. The sun climbed higher as Layla followed the fuwa, hoofprints leading down into the valley, their edges already softening with fresh snow. She did not look back, but kept her eyes fixed on the horizon where the mountains met the sky. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay Fort Garland and Jackson, and whatever justice or mercy God had in store for them both. The mountain trails showed Layla no mercy. Each hoofprint left by Jackson's captors had filled with fresh snow, leaving only the vaguest path to follow. The mule picked its way carefully through the drifts, steam rising from its flanks despite the bitter cold. Layla's hands, though wrapped in wool mittens, ached from gripping the reins. That first night, she made camp beside a half-frozen creek. The water still sang beneath its icy shell, reminding her of hymns sung in warmer times. She gathered wood the way Jackson had taught her, selecting the driest branches from beneath the pines. The small fire cast dancing shadows as she heated beans and coffee in Jackson's battered tin pot. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "guide my path to where justice needs mercy's touch." The stars wheeled overhead, crystal bright in the mountain air. Layla wrapped herself in Jackson's old blanket, breathing in the lingering scent of wood smoke that clung to the wool. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by the haunting cry of coyotes. Dawn brought fresh challenges. The trail led upward, switchbacking across a wind-scoured pass where the air grew thin and sharp. Layla's chest burned with each breath. The mule struggled, its hooves slipping on ice-covered rock. Near the summit, a sudden gust nearly unseated her. She clung to the saddle horn, dizzy from the height and cold. "Just a little further," she urged the mule, though her lips were too numb to form the words properly. They made it over the pass as the sun began to set, but Layla's victory was short-lived. The descent proved treacherous in the gathering dark. She had to dismount and lead the mule, her feet breaking through crusty snow with every step. By the time she found suitable shelter beneath an overhanging rock, exhaustion had settled into her bones like lead. The second day brought snow flurries that obscured the distant peaks. Layla kept the mule pointed southeast, remembering Jackson's lessons about reading the land. When the clouds parted briefly, she caught glimpses of Fort Garland's valley far below. The sight gave her renewed strength, though her muscles protested every movement. On the third day, she spotted smoke rising from a relay station, a welcome sight after the endless wilderness. The station keeper, a gruff man with a silver mustache, looked her over with suspicious eyes. "Courier headed to the fort tomorrow morning," he said when she asked about delivering her letter. "Cost you 2 bits." Layla's fingers trembled as she counted out the coins. The letter, sealed with a bit of candle wax, represented her best hope for Jackson. She watched the station keeper tuck it into his mail pouch, praying it would reach sympathetic hands. The 4th day tested her resolve most severely. The trail descended through patches of dead timber where shadows played tricks on her tired eyes. Every cracking branch sounded like a rifle shot. The mule grew increasingly nervous, sensing its rider's fatigue. Near sunset on the 5th day, Fort Garland's walls finally rose before her, stark adobe and timber against the mountains. The sight of the American flag snapping in the wind brought tears to her frost-chapped cheeks. 2 soldiers manning the gate straightened as she approached, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and derision. "Well, look what we got here," one called out. "The deserter's fat woman's come beggin'." The other guard chuckled, but Layla sat straighter in her saddle. Years of mockery had taught her dignity's worth. In a clear voice that carried across the yard, she quoted from James, "Mercy triumphs over judgment." The laughter died. A few heads turned toward her, including that of an older man wearing a chaplain's collar. He approached, boots crunching in the snow. "You've come about Jackson Grant?" the chaplain asked, his tone gentle. "Yes, sir," Layla replied. "I've ridden 4 days to speak on his behalf." The chaplain studied her face, noting perhaps the determination beneath her exhaustion. "Come with me," he said finally. "We'll get you warm, and then we'll see about arranging a hearing." Inside the chaplain's quarters, Layla's numb fingers slowly regained feeling around a tin cup of hot coffee. She brought out the wooden cross Jackson had carved, along with other small pieces he'd shaped during their winter together. A tiny bear, a leaping deer, a soaring eagle. Each told part of his story, she explained to the chaplain. "And this," she said, carefully unfolding Nietzsche's note, written in flowing Apache script with English translations beneath. "From those who chose forgiveness over vengeance." The chaplain read the note carefully, his weathered face thoughtful. "I'll speak to Colonel Harrison," he said. "The law has its demands, but so does conscience." He paused, then added, "You showed great courage coming here, miss." "Not courage," Layla corrected softly. "Faith." The chaplain nodded, understanding. He left her with a promise to return soon. Layla sat beside his small stove, warming her hands and preparing the words she would speak in Jackson's defense. Outside the window, she could see the prison block where he was held. Her heart ached to think of him in chains, but she forced herself to focus on hope instead of fear. When the chaplain returned an hour later, his expression was cautiously optimistic. "The colonel will hear you tomorrow morning," he said. "I suggest you rest well tonight. Military courts require both truth and grace to bend." Layla closed her eyes in silent thanks. She had made it this far on prayer and determination. Tomorrow would test both again, but for now she allowed herself to feel the first faint stirrings of hope. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, she imagined she could hear coyotes singing, wild and free as God's mercy itself. Dawn broke cold and clear over Fort Garland. Frost patterns traced the windows of the commandant's office where the hearing would take place. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow over polished wood furniture, and maps hung on whitewashed walls. A long table dominated the room, behind which sat Colonel Harrison, his weathered face impassive as stone. Jackson stood before them, chains binding his wrists and ankles. The metal clinked softly with each shallow breath. His beard had grown ragged during his confinement, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Yet he held himself straight, meeting the colonel's gaze without flinching. Layla sat nearby on a wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The chaplain stood at her shoulder, a quiet presence of support. Through the window she could see guards patrolling the yard, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. "Private Jackson Grant," Colonel Harrison began, his voice filling the hushed room. "You stand accused of desertion during active duty, abandoning your post under Colonel Harlan's command in 1873. He paused, shuffling through papers before him. "You understand this carries the sentence of death by hanging?" "Yes, sir," Jackson answered quietly. "Do you deny these charges?" "No, sir." The colonel's pen scratched against paper, the sound sharp in the stillness. "Given the severity of this offense and your admission of guilt, I see no reason to prolong—" "Please, sir." Layla stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the floorboards. "I ask permission to speak on his behalf." Colonel Harrison frowned, glancing at the chaplain, who nodded slightly. "Very well, Mrs. Hargrove. Though I warn you, military law leaves little room for sentiment." Layla drew a deep breath, steadying herself. "I do not speak from sentiment, sir, but from witness of God's truth." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "The man you see before you did desert his post, but he did so not from cowardice or betrayal of duty, but from obedience to a higher command, his conscience." She moved closer to the table, reaching into her pocket to withdraw Jackson's wooden carvings. "These tell his story, sir. This cross he shaped while teaching an Apache boy to carve, the same boy whose people he once wronged and who he later helped save." The colonel picked up the small cross, turning it in his hands. "Continue." "Jackson was ordered to burn a village that had already surrendered," Layla said, her voice catching. "Women, children, elders who had laid down their weapons in trust. He could not do it, would not do it. Is that not also a soldier's duty? To refuse an order that violates God's law?" Jackson's chains rattled softly as he shifted his weight. Tears tracked silently down his cheeks. "And what of the 5 years since?" Colonel Harrison asked. "Living as a fugitive, hiding from justice?" "Living in penance," Layla corrected gently. "Alone in the mountains, helping travelers, teaching me to survive the winter. And when that same Apache boy collapsed in the snow near our cabin, Jackson helped nurse him back to health, knowing it might bring his past to light." She placed Nietzsche's note on the table. "This is written by the boy's mother, whose village was burned that day. In it, she speaks of forgiveness freely given, of choosing mercy over vengeance." The colonel studied the mixed Apache and English text, his expression thoughtful. "These are fine words, Mrs. Hargrove, but military discipline—" A commotion outside interrupted him. Boots thundered in the hallway, and the door swung open. The chaplain entered, followed by Nietzsche herself, wearing a blanket of finest weave. Behind her came 2 tribal elders and her son, their faces dignified and calm. The guards who had escorted them stayed by the door, hands nervously near their weapons. The room fell silent. Nietzsche's presence seemed to fill the space with quiet authority. She looked first at Jackson, then at the colonel, before speaking in careful English. "We come to stand for truth," she said. "This man's hands once brought pain. Now they bring healing." She gestured to her son. "He saved my boy when others would have left him to die. The Great Spirit teaches that mercy must answer mercy." Colonel Harrison stood slowly, clearly shaken by this unexpected testimony. "This is unusual," he said. "Military law dictates—" "Your law speaks of justice," Nietzsche interrupted. Our law speaks of balance. When one chooses right over wrong, even late, the scales must shift. She placed a string of gleaming blue beads on the table. These are for life preserved. Will your justice now demand death? The colonel sank back into his chair, running a hand over his face. The morning light through the windows had strengthened, throwing the room's shadows into sharp relief. Finally, he spoke. In my 30 years of service, I have never encountered a case quite like this. He gathered the papers before him, squaring their edges with precise movements. Given the extraordinary circumstances and testimony presented, I find myself unable to proceed with immediate judgment. Hope flickered in Layla's chest as the colonel continued. I will suspend verdict pending consultation with the territorial governor. Private Grant will remain in custody, but he glanced at the chaplain. He may be moved to more comfortable quarters under guard. Thank you, sir, Layla whispered, her legs weak with relief. She hurried to Jackson's side, taking his shackled hand in hers. His fingers gripped hers tightly as tears continued to track down his face. Nietzsche approached them, touching Jackson's shoulder lightly. All spirits sing when hatred dies, she said softly. Remember this. Her son pressed close to her side, looking up at Jackson with solemn eyes. The guards stepped forward to lead Jackson away, but Colonel Harrison raised his hand. A moment. He stood and walked around the table, stopping before Jackson. I would hear it from your own lips, Private. Why did you desert? Jackson straightened, his voice rough with emotion. Because there are orders that damn a man's soul to follow them, sir. I chose to answer to God's command rather than man's. The colonel nodded slowly. Very well. Take him to the chaplain's quarters. Post a guard, but let him visit with his... He glanced at Layla. His family. As they led Jackson away, Layla felt Nietzsche's hand slip into hers. Together they watched him go, their breath mingling in the cold morning air. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, melting the frost from the windows and casting long shadows across the parade ground. Somewhere in the distance, a bugle called the morning assembly, its notes clear and bright against the crystal sky. The chaplain touched Layla's shoulder gently. Come, he said. There's coffee warming in my quarters, and you all look in need of it. He smiled at Nietzsche and her people. All of you. We have much to discuss while we await word from the governor. They filed out of the commandant's office, leaving behind the wooden cross and beads on the colonel's table, symbols of judgment suspended, of mercy taking root in unexpected soil. Layla's heart felt lighter than it had in days, though she knew the final verdict was still to come. For now it was enough that love and truth had been spoken, and that even the hard rules of military justice could bend before the power of forgiveness. The letter arrived on a crisp morning, carried by a dust-covered courier. Colonel Harrison read it twice before summoning them to his office. Sunlight streamed through the windows as he delivered the news. Jackson Grant was pardoned under moral parole, his military service redeemed by acts of peace. The words rang clear as chapel bells. You're free to go, the colonel said, handing Jackson his discharge papers. The territory needs more men who choose conscience over blind duty. Layla's hands trembled as she helped Jackson gather his few belongings from the chaplain's quarters. Outside, soldiers lined the parade ground, faces solemn. These same men who had jeered at her arrival now stood at respectful attention. A few even touched their hats as she passed. Ma'am, one young private said softly, we was wrong about you both. Jackson's horse stamped impatiently, his coat gleaming in the morning light. Layla steadied the reins while Jackson mounted, his movements still stiff from weeks in confinement. She climbed onto her mule, and together they rode through the fort gates, leaving behind the weight of judgment, The journey home stretched 4 days through melting snow. They spoke little, but their silence held peace instead of fear. Each night they shared coffee by the campfire, their shoulders touching as they watched the stars wheel overhead. When they crested the final ridge, their cabin stood waiting, smoke rising straight and true from the chimney. Someone had been tending the fire. As they drew closer, they saw fresh tracks in the mud. Neighbors had been watching over their home. That evening, Martha Wells from the general store arrived with a basket of bread and preserves. "We was wrong to laugh that day," she said, cheeks flushing. "You showed us all what real courage looks like." Other families followed, bringing food and hesitant smiles of welcome. 3 days later, Nietzsche and her people arrived, their horses laden with gifts. Beautiful beadwork caught the sun, and leather pouches bulged with seeds for spring planting. The boy Jackson had saved ran to hug them both, chattering in mixed Apache and English. They celebrated under the warming sky, sharing food and stories as the last snow melted from the eaves. Jackson watched it all with wonder in his eyes, his hand finding Layla's. "Reckon this old smokehouse could be put to better use," he said quietly. "Plenty of children hereabouts need learning, Indian and white both." Layla squeezed his fingers. "I could teach them on Sundays," she offered, "after church service." So Jackson set to work, transforming the sturdy log building into a simple schoolroom. He carved new benches while Layla cleaned and hung curtains at the windows. When Sunday came, children filled the space with laughter and song, their voices rising together in hymns of praise. Springtime painted the valley in soft greens and golds, wildflowers dotting the meadows where snow had lain. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with bird song carrying through the warming air. Pine boughs swayed gently overhead as neighbors gathered in their Sunday best, forming a circle beneath the ancient trees. Nietzsche and her people arrived dressed in ceremonial clothing, their presence transforming the simple frontier wedding into something sacred. They arranged themselves in a half-circle, voices rising and falling in traditional blessing songs that echoed off the mountainside. The melody wrapped around the gathering like a blanket of peace. Boone, Jackson's faithful wolfhound, stretched out contentedly at the couple's feet, his tail thumping softly against the earth. The preacher from Silver Bend stood before them, his weathered Bible open in his hands. Even Marshall Dodd stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, his hat clutched respectfully against his chest, his face softened by something that might have been wisdom. Layla wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, with tiny white flowers stitched around the collar. Jackson had shaved clean and donned a new shirt, though his hands still bore the honest calluses of his work. When they joined hands, his fingers trembled slightly against hers. "What God has joined," the preacher proclaimed, his voice carrying across the valley, "let no man put asunder." As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows through the pines, the celebration moved inside their cabin. Lamplight cast a warm glow through the windows, and the scent of coffee and pine smoke mingled in the evening air. Layla sat at the rough-hewn table, ink flowing across paper as she wrote to her sister back in Missouri. "Dearest Sarah," she wrote, her heart full, "I came west seeking a husband. I found forgiveness instead, and a man who could not resist the heart God made in me." Jackson read the words over her shoulder, his presence warm and solid behind her chair. He bent down and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek, his beard tickling her skin. The simple gesture held years of loneliness transformed into belonging. Outside, Boone lifted his voice to the emerging stars, his howl carrying across the valley like a song of celebration. The spring wind caught the sound, carrying it down the mountainside, whispering peace through the pines. In that moment, The cabin glowed like a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk, a testament to the power of mercy to heal what justice alone could not mend. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.